Greetings, Shabbat Shalom. We have a saying up north, in the northern part of the United States. I'm speaking from the southeast. I'm speaking from central Florida. But there's a saying in the northern part of the United States, March comes in like a lion and goes out like a lamb. And I think those of you who are in Montana, would appreciate that. I warned all of you that in an intercalary year, it seems that the winter lasts longer. So some of you optimists depended on the groundhog, and you ignored my warnings. I'm kidding, but somebody wrote to me and said, "You're a prophet. You talked about a longer winter." So I said, you can just call me Punxsutawney Mark. For those of you who haven't heard of Punxsutawney Phil, that's what we call the groundhog, in Groundhog Day, who supposedly predicts the length of the winter. Well, we're in the winter technically anyway, one way or the other. Fortunately, in Florida, we have very pleasant weather, and that's why so many people are down here now visiting. The more the merrier. Come on down. I suppose a lot of you have heard of Rush Limbaugh. I don't know how many of you have heard of his brother David, but his brother David has written some very interesting books, and one of them is called the Emmaus Code. And it's talking about Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. I gave a sermon in Corpus Christi back in 1990 at the Festival of Tabernacles where I talked about Jesus Christ as the hero of the holy days. And that evidently did have some impact. Just a few years ago, somebody mentioned that he remembered that sermon. I want to go to Luke 24 and verse 44. And here they are on the way to Emmaus. This is where where David Limbaugh got his title. By the way, regarding that book, I read it. I would recommend it, but I would certainly have disagreements with some of it. I'm not endorsing everything in there. But anyway, in Luke 24:44, then he said to me, "These are my words that I spoke to while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." An awful lot of the entire Bible has to do with Jesus Christ. And I want to quote from Acts 5 and verse 30. I know this is very basic, but there are some of you out there that need to hear this. Acts 5 and verse 30. Here Peter is talking to the Jews of, like around the 30s, AD 30s, after soon after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So we're in first century Judea, and Peter is speaking here, and he says, "The God of our ancestors raised up Jesus, whom you had killed by hanging him on a tree." Well, they had not directly done it, but their leadership had conspired with the Romans to have it done. So we're talking about to the very crowd that probably were stirred up to shout, "Crucify him," back, sometime earlier. But the point is that the God of their ancestors raised up Jesus, of course. There's only one God. The God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament, omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, eternal, perfect love, only one God. And Jesus Christ, the Logos, the Word, is certainly very much in the entire Bible, from beginning to end, for that matter. Today I want to give two perspectives of a biblical prophecy, or two perspectives, maybe I should say two perspectives on a biblical prophecy. Perspectives of sounds better. Two perspectives of a biblical prophecy. And it's one that maybe many of you have heard. The so-called 70 weeks prophecy at the conclusion of the 9th chapter of the book of Daniel. Now I want to show you today is why it is that, yes, the abomination of desolation, which is here in Daniel more than once, it does occur very prominently, one way or the other, in the New Testament. The New Testament has I would say, much to at least imply, much to say, and then beyond that to imply about the abomination of desolation. But the actual 70 weeks are not quoted in the New Testament. They're not used as you might quote say a proof text, and yet at the same time, when you read it in most of your translations, it's so powerful, such a powerful bridge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so today I'm going to give you two perspectives of the. I'm still trying to think what the proper preposition ought to be. Okay, let me put it this way then: two ways to view a biblical prophecy. That gives me an easier time of it. Two ways to view a biblical prophecy. First, let's talk about the Masoretic text, the traditional Hebrew text that the Jews of Jesus' day would have been part of their tradition and would have been part of the tradition of the Jews from there on. It does not have to do with difference of words, ladies and gentlemen. It has to do with difference of punctuation. A friend of mine one time came to me and said, What time do you get up? In the morning? That's not the way we normally say it, right? He put a comma there. Normally we don't put a comma there. What time do you get up in the morning? You see the difference the comma makes. Punctuation makes a difference in Daniel 9. I want to read the New Revised Standard Version. This is what students are going to read if they take a university class on the Bible. And this is based on the Masoretic text in this case. Daniel 9, verse 24. Before I go further, let me just say, the Masoretic text, which I'm going to read, does not compel you in the same way that the Septuagint text would compel you. And the Septuagint text is used by most translations, because most translations are done by Christians, and they want Daniel 9 to really come out and prophesy about Jesus Christ, which it does in the Septuagint version. So it's fine to have it. It's a very powerful tool. And let's go back to the first century. Let's go to Acts 1 and verse 8. Let me go back to the New King James, which is normally the Bible I use when I give these talks. I'm going to go to Acts 1 and verse 8 in the New King James translation. And this is, of course, a very famous passage because we don't know when Christ is coming back, but the church has a job to do, and that is to keep the faith and spread it. John 1:8. But you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be witnesses to me in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. So he told them, this word is going to spread to the end of the earth. And if you read the book of Acts, the church grew exponentially in the beginning. Major explosive growth in the beginning. And one reason was because of the Greek-speaking diaspora. Now, there were the Aramaic-speaking Jews who also had, many of them, a familiarity with Hebrew there in the land of Israel. And then over in Iraq, there was the huge community, the Babylonian Jewish community that spoke Aramaic, a language related to Hebrew. And then there was, in the West, the huge diaspora that spoke Greek, particularly the Alexandrian community, the community in Alexandria, Egypt, that at that time was very numerous and was Greek-speaking. And they had the Septuagint version of the Bible. And the Septuagint version of the Bible preserved traditions that were very compelling in terms of leading to the acceptance of Jesus Christ. And so the majority of quotations in the New Testament are coming from the Septuagint, but a third of them are not, from what I understand. A third of them are not, but 2/3 of them are. And the Septuagint, as I said, the way it spun things, I don't mean to be a pejorative term. The way the Septuagint preserved the Hebrew text was very conducive to Christian preaching, and this is why the Jewish community ultimately rejected the Septuagint for their use, and they went to another translation. In the 2nd century A.D., a translation was produced by Aquila, who was supposed to be a disciple of the great Rabbi Akiva and had been a convert. I think I read one account that said he converted from paganism to Christianity and finally to Judaism. his version, his translation of the Old Testament became the standard Greek translation rather than the Septuagint. And I believe, from what I've studied in earlier days, that the Jews did not want the Septuagint because it was too pro-Christian, the way it translated things. Is that okay until now? So now let's go back and look at Daniel 9 in the NRSV, which is based in this case on the Masoretic text, the traditional Hebrew text. And it has to do with punctuation. The words have not changed. The punctuation is different than what you're familiar with. I believe the French Bible may do it this way, the standard French translation. It's possible. But anyway, here it is in the NRSV. I haven't checked my French Bible to see, so if any of you want to check. Daniel 9:24. 70 weeks are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Now, when you read this, you would think this is leading to the climax of human history and to the ultimate coming of the Messiah. And I think you could read that and draw that conclusion. However, you could also draw the conclusion that there could be a historical type for that before the actual antitype. And so a person reading this prophecy could believe that the great revival, the great spiritual revival of the Maccabean period, which we Jews commemorate in the holiday of Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, which Jesus kept, John 10, verse 22-23. That pictures the great revival, spiritual revival at the time of the Maccabees. If you go back 490 years, 70 weeks of years, we know the principle of a day for a year in prophecy. Ezekiel 4:6, Numbers 14:34, Ezekiel 4:6, the principle of a day for a year. And we understand the principle of the sabbatical year. Pardon me. Anyway, we have the 7-year cycles there. But anyway, if you go back 490 years from the cleansing of the temple under the Maccabees, you come to the period of the king of Judah, Manasseh, who polluted the temple and was a very wicked king. Now he finally repented, but much of his reign was very negative, and the temple was misused, abused, and polluted. And later on, of course, it was cleansed, and then later on destroyed, but then rebuilt, then polluted, and then finally cleansed again, and it remained in that state until it was destroyed by the Romans. So the final cleansing before its final destruction was under the Maccabees. And so you could say that this prophecy does refer to 490 years from the time of King Manasseh to the time of the Maccabees, which is a very critically important time in the history of God's church. Now we read further. Know therefore, and understand that from the time of the word went out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the time of an anointed prince, there shall be 7 weeks. So we have a 7-week period now, 49 years. And this could represent the time from when the Jews began to come back under Cyrus to rebuild Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple and the walls of the city, though it took a long time, but they began to do it at the time of King Cyrus. If you go 49 years after that, you come to the lifetime of Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel was a critically important figure in the history of God's church. As you know, he was the secular leader who, together with the high priest Joshua, or Jeshua, he's called in some places, he did supervise the rebuilding of the temple. And I want to go to the book of Haggai because there's a beautiful prophecy about Zerubbabel showing his importance. Now, he was a descendant of David, and he was not a king over the Jews, but he was a governor over the Jews. And I want to go to Haggai. It's not a long book, see. These are minor prophets, so I skipped right over Haggai. It's only 2 chapters. And that is why the Jews call these the Treasar, the 12, and they put them in one scroll. This way they're not lost, the minor prophets. So let's go to Haggai 2 and look at what it says at the end. It seems that this prophecy ultimately goes to the end time, whatever it meant historically, but it does seem to point to the end time. Verse 22 of Haggai 2. I will overthrow the throne of kingdoms. I will destroy the strength of the Gentile kingdoms. I will overthrow the chariots and those who ride in them. The horses and their riders shall come down, every one by the sword of his brother. In that day, says the Eternal of hosts, I will take you, Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, says the Eternal, and will make you like a signet ring, for I have chosen you, says the Eternal of hosts. And so this prophecy does seem to point to Zerubbabel here. So again, because even we have a similar language here, to seal both vision and prophet, to anoint a most holy place. Well, no, I wanted to go further, but that reference may imply something of Zerubbabel later, although I know it does seem to have an end time significance. But anyway, know therefore and understand from the time that the word went out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the time of the anointed prince, there shall be 7 weeks. So we have those 49 years from the return from Babylon to the time of Zerubbabel. And now we have another period. And for 62 weeks, see, there's a semicolon in my Bible. And etnachtah, as you're chanting it in the Hebrew, you have a long pause. It's called etnachtah. It's equivalent of a semicolon. Now, these punctuation marks were added much later, way much later, but they do reflect the tradition of how this would have been read. And for 62 weeks it shall be built again with streets and moat, but in troubled times. So this refers to, this would be 434 years, right? Well, where the work is being done, the city is being rebuilt, but there's a lot of trouble going on. If you read the history of that city, indeed, there was trouble. After the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off, and shall have nothing. That's one way to understand it. There's more than one way to translate that, but shall have nothing is one way to translate it. And the troops of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Well, this could be referring to the time of the Hasmoneans, and there was a particular Hasmonean king who in a way usurped the throne, in a sense. Judah Aristobulus, he in effect usurped the throne, and so from the time that they began to rebuild the city until his time was 434 years, and he died of an illness and wound up, losing everything. He was not able to establish his monarchy beyond his brief reign of a year or so, and he died of an illness, and that was the end of it. And the troops of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. This may refer to then to the final destruction of Jerusalem later on. After the time of the Maccabees, it was finally destroyed. In AD 70, and the Jews remained. Let's put it this way: from that point on, they were a much more fully subjugated people. Their temple was destroyed. Many of them were living in exile, and even though there were some other revolts, but 70 AD marked a tremendously traumatic time in the history of God's church, which at that time were the Jewish people. The temple was destroyed. Jerusalem was very much destroyed. Many people died. Many were exiled, and there were still some efforts to rebuild and restore as time went on. But finally, as we know, by the 2nd century AD, pretty much everything was over with, both politically and spiritually, for the Jews in the land of Israel. So this could refer to that period, which was a generation after the first coming of Christ. Now, there may be other ways to understand this, of course, as we know, it was, I believe, Titus who was the actual one who destroyed the temple. Vespasian was there, but then he was called back to become emperor, and so Titus, I believe, finally was the one who destroyed Jerusalem. Then later on, he did become emperor, and there is an Arch of Titus in Rome today, which pictures the destruction of Jerusalem and the carrying away of the various vessels of the temple. And so, but he was only a type of a tyrant yet to come, who will destroy Jerusalem and who will also do more. The Romans at the time of Titus destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, but as you know, Antiochus, whom the Maccabees defeated, had come into the temple and had brought about the abomination of desolation. And in the end time, there's going to be some kind of fulfillment of that abomination of desolation. So the end time tyrant will conquer Jerusalem, and in some way, however that is to be understood, will reenact the abomination of desolation in some fashion. His will be the antitype of the original type of what Antiochus did back in 167 BC. Then we finally have verse 27, and that could refer then to this end-time tyrant, because remember, the original verse of verse 24, although it could have pointed to the time of the Maccabees, really also pointed to the end time, and so now we could very well be at that end time. However, we could be talking, about what happened anciently as well, and in that case, we're talking about what Antiochus did, but he shall make a covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall make sacrifice and offering cease, and in their place shall be an abomination that desolates, until so that there you see a reference to that, until the decreed end is poured out upon the desolator. So this may be a reference back to Antiochus, who was in one sense a type of the Romans. They came and conquered Jerusalem and destroyed it. What he did was he conquered it, and he didn't destroy the temple, but he made the abomination of desolations there. So it might be in effect a retro reference to him. However, it says here that it's going to be for half the week he shall make sacrifice and offering cease. Now half the week is 3.5 years. Now that's not what happened under Antiochus. It was only 3 years under Antiochus. You can see that very clearly in Daniel 8. 1,150 mornings, 2,300 more evenings and mornings. 2,300 evening and morning sacrifices were stopped during the time of Antiochus. It lasted 1,150 days, 3 years. So Antiochus, if this is talking about him, was only a type, not the final fulfillment. The final fulfillment will be evidently a 3.5 year period. So you see, you may have some, I have even some questions as I'm going through this about how quite to understand this. And if you study commentaries based on this translation, you'll find differences of opinion. For example, if you go to the Sonsino commentary, which was a standard traditional Jewish commentary on Daniel 9, it's very sparse. I think they don't want to really spend all that much time on it because they're really not sure quite how to handle it for modern readers. But there are some references there that you could wrestle with. But that is a way to take it. In effect, you have these 3 periods of time that are 3 distinct periods of time. So when you're reading it in the traditional Hebrew, there's a lot of possible information here, but not necessarily a specific reference to that would cause you to think that in 27 AD, here the Messiah has come. You wouldn't necessarily think that. It does point to what the Messiah will do, because it does say that ultimately, look at how it starts. 70 weeks are decreed for your people in your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. So it is looking to a messianic prophecy and what the Messiah will do, and it certainly does point to what Jesus Christ ultimately will do. And even here, it says that there'll be an abomination until the decreed end is poured out upon the desolator. So he loses, so God wins, and the the tyrant loses. Now, as I'm saying, this is how the punctuation works out in the Masoretic text, and so it does provide you with food for thought. And as I said, even as I was going through this, I was thinking there's a weakness in my presentation that I have to correct at another time. Even as I was going through it, I noticed a certain kind of hole in my logic there, and so I have to I have to take yet another look at this. But the point I'm bringing out is that there's a lot of information here about what happened historically to Jerusalem, to the Jewish people who were God's church in those days, and so on. But yet, if you look at the Septuagint version, you have a very compelling case for the fact that in 27 A.D., the Messiah is going to appear. So you could just imagine that when you go to the Greek-speaking world in the first century, when you go to Alexandria, when you go to Berea, when you go to these areas where the Jews translated the Bible into Greek and were studying it in Greek, they may have been reading it in Hebrew on the Sabbath, but they were studying it then in Greek because that was the language that they knew. Just like American Jews today, they go to synagogue, they hear the Bible in Hebrew, they go home and read it in English. So now we go to Daniel 9 and to go to verse 24. And now you're going to see, if you're using most English translations, I have to realize Daniel 9 comes after Ezekiel in these versions. So if you look at Daniel 9:24, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to set up a vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. 69 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. But the 69 weeks carry us all the way to 27 A.D. from 457. Go back to Ezra 7, and you'll see that it was finally 457 when Cyrus's decree could be fully implemented. It was promulgated by Cyrus. There was a disruption. It was re-decreed by Darius. There was further disruption, and then finally in 457, under Ezra, we find the possibility of fully implementing it, which finally Nehemiah does in 444 BC or so later on. So it was in 457 really that the decree took full effect. And you go from 457 and you come to 27 AD because remember, there is no year zero. You go from 1 BC to 1 AD. So calculating 483 years goes from 457 BC, which is the end of the last Jubilee year ever noted. No more Jubilee years after that, just sabbatical years. Anyway, it goes from 457 to 27 AD, and somebody shows up, all right? And so a 3.5 year ministry, and therefore the Greek-speaking Jews having this prophecy in front of them in this form, you could see how powerful it was. It's not quoted in the New Testament, but I would imagine it was dealt with as people went out and preached. And after the 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. That's another way to understand it. He did not. He was not worthy of any kind of punishment at all. He was sinless. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. And so that could refer to the generation after Christ. He warned them, and there was a destruction. And then we find this power that destroyed Jerusalem comes up again in the end time. This end time tyrant who is leading a revived Roman Empire. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. So what do you think he calculates that? Probably not. He decides to have a covenant 7 years before Christ returns, and 3.5 years into it, he performs the abomination of desolation. That begins the tribulation period, which is 3.5 years. So it's not like he says, let's have a 7-year pact. He has a pact that turns out to last 7 years, and the last 3.5 are the tribulation. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, and for half a week he shall bring an end to the sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. That's one way to understand it. But even with this translation, there's another way to understand it that I hope you know, and you're going to hear something I hope that you're familiar with in just a moment. After the destruction, or as at the time of the coming of this Messiah, even though afterwards there will be a destruction of the city, but now we're going back and talking about the ministry of that anointed one who comes after the 69 weeks. You know, it's after 62 weeks, but there's also the other 7. So remember, it was 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So it's worded stylistically a bit awkwardly, perhaps. But if you look back at 25, it says awkwardly from our point of view. I'm not saying that that Daniel was awkward. I'm saying, from our point of view, in the English-speaking world in 2019, it may seem awkward. It talks about 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and then so after the 62 weeks also is after 7 and 62, 69. And so now we're going to talk about his ministry in verse 27. Now, why is it worded that way, 7 weeks and 62? Possibly because the second temple was refurbished. Remember John 2? 46 years it was refurbished. And very likely 3 more years later on, it was further refurbished. So altogether 49. And that may be why the prophecy says, 7 weeks and 62 weeks, to just focusing on the fact that for 49 years they were refurbishing the temple. That's a possibility, okay? But now let's say that we're talking about the Messiah, the Christ. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, and in the middle of the week. That's another way to understand it. Chatzi Shavua, is it half a week, or is it in the middle of the week? Could mean in the middle of the week. So in that case, the tyrant makes a pact, and it turns out that in the middle of that 7-year period, which is the length of the pact, he does these horrible things. That's one way to understand it. Another way to understand it, though, is to say that in the middle of his ministry, he's cut off. That he's given a 7-year ministry, but 3.5 years are completed in his first coming. If you look at the Gospels, Jesus Christ has a 3.5-year ministry. Then he's cut off in the midst of the week. In the midst of a week of years, he's cut off. Which means that when he returns, he finishes that work that he started. With his second coming, remember when he read that prophecy in Isaiah, he stopped in the middle of a passage because he wasn't going to do it all then. He was coming then to be our Savior. He comes now also as King of Kings, Lord of Lords, to take over the throne of the world. So he fulfilled part of his ministry. There's a second coming yet ahead. So after 3.5 years, he was cut off. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. Now, how did he do that? They continued to offer sacrifices after his crucifixion, but he put an end to the need for the Old Testament sacrificial system involving personal sacrifices. He is our sacrifice. He is the sacrifice par excellence. The Old Testament sacrifices for sin pointed to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Once he actually became our sacrifice, the need for you and I to bring personal sacrifices was over. But even beyond that, his death also, in effect, began the process that a generation later led to the end of the sacrifices. A generation after Christ, and he warned them about that. He said in Matthew 12:40, he said that he was to be compared to Jonah. One thing about Jonah said, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh will be destroyed." Well, day for a year in prophecy. 40 years after Christ talked to them in Matthew 12, the temple was destroyed, and sacrifices have not been offered ever since. So in that sense, too, you could say he ended the sacrificial system because his death really was the cause for what happened 40 years later, or roughly 40 years later. He died, I believe, in 31, and the destruction came in 70. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week He shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, talking about the Antichrist, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. So maybe by now your head is spinning, but what I'm telling you is that when you read this prophecy, if it were 27 AD or thereafter, and you were reading this prophecy in the Septuagint version, you would think, oh wow, this just fits, it's right down the line. Now, if you're reading in the Masoretic version, there's a lot of information there, but it doesn't compel you in the same way as this version. So both are available to us, and the Masoretic text is the standard Old Testament we should use, but we should, we can further illuminate it with certain passages from the Septuagint, such as this one, and that further completes our understanding. There are other passages of that sort too, where the Septuagint can be elaborate on the Hebrew text and can develop further our understanding, and particularly point, of course, to the ministry of Jesus Christ. If I want to go to Galatians 4 and verse 4, in Galatians 4 and verse 4, we find that God had a timetable, and indeed, when the time was right, Jesus Christ came, as Daniel 9 would show you in that version. In Galatians 4 and verse 4, we talk about pleroma, the fullness in Greek. Galatians 4:4. But when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. So the fullness of time had come. And in many, many ways, if you look at the first century, when Jesus Christ came in AD 27, the world was prepared for the rapid spread of the church in many ways. And one way was through the Septuagint. That was one way. Another was through the Roman Empire and the roads that Rome had built connecting cities together, etc., and the Roman citizenship that Paul made use of, etc. I mean, there were various factors. Also the spread of the Jewish community, the diaspora, the spread of the Bible. So many things were set up so that the fullness of time, and Christ came at the fullness of time, and from the point of view of Daniel 9, he came right on time. Hopefully you're with me on that. I want to go to John 5 and verse 39. So all through the Old Testament, you could see indications of Jesus Christ's ministry, what he would do and how he would do it. And that is really the most important way of, let's say, if a Jewish person were open-minded to consider the gospel, how would one go about discussing it? Not specific prophecies that Jesus Christ fulfilled, all of these specific details, because it's 2,000 years later. How do we know? If you're looking at it from a skeptical point of view, how do we know how much Judas betrayed him for, or these other things? Yes, they're in the Bible, hundreds of them, but how do we know? So maybe some skilled Bible scholar put them in later to prove his point. But one thing you can do is you can look at the Old Testament and see the whole picture, the whole theme. What is it talking about? You can see Genesis 22, the sacrifice of Isaac. You can see Exodus 12, the Passover. And the whole theme of the Old Testament, you could read the book of Leviticus with the sacrificial system. And you can understand then from just the essence of what the Old Testament is talking about, the need for the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And you can look at the holy days and meanings that you draw from them. So rather than pick apart individual detailed prophecies that happened 2,000 years ago, we can say, what is the message of the Old Testament? And we can then understand that the Old Testament is best understood through the New Testament rather than the Talmud. That if you have the apostolic interpretation or the rabbinic interpretation, take the apostolic interpretation. This was the decision that I had to make many years ago. Let's go to John 5 and verse 39. And Jesus told the religious people of his day, John 5:39, you search the scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life. And indeed you would if you understood them properly, right? And these are they which testify of me. Indeed, from cover to cover, Genesis through Revelation, the Bible does talk about God's plan of salvation, and the central personality in the Bible is Jesus Christ. And we can also understand that from what I covered today, 2 ways of understanding a Bible prophecy. All the best to you and yours.